If you've seen the movie North Country starring Charlize Theron, you might already be familiar with this story because that movie was loosely based on the case we are talking about today. And the case is Lois Jenson versus Eveleth Taconite, which was the first ever class action sexual harassment lawsuit in US history. While North Country really dramatized some of the events for storytelling, the reality of what Jensen and her coworkers endured was just as disturbing, if not worse. And today, we are talking about what really happened. So, by the end of this video, you'll understand how Lois Jensen fought against discrimination, the intense legal battle she faced, and how her fight led to major changes in what is acceptable at work. You'll also learn how standing up against injustice for just one person, even when it seems impossible, can make a big difference for everyone. Hi, I'm Harlow Reed, employment lawyer, HR consultant, and creator of the HRInsider. On this channel, I do more than share my legal opinion. I break down real legal cases to show how the law might apply to your situation. Okay, so I don't know about you, but sometimes going to work day after day can feel like treading water between project deadlines, career responsibilities, and managing workplace relationships. It's easy to feel like we're just staying afloat rather than moving forward. But every day, employees make choices that shape the workplace, some in small ways, others in ways that leave a lasting impact. And some go up against impossible odds to create real change. Today, we are talking about one of those employees, Lois Jenson, someone who stood up, fought back, and changed the workplace forever. Imagine going to work every day knowing you'll face relentless harassment just because you're a woman. Now imagine standing up against it, not just for yourself and concerns about your work environment, but for every woman who's there with you and every woman who comes after you. That's exactly what Lois Jensen did, and her fight changed harassment laws forever for all of us. Before there was Anita Hill or Me Too, there was Lois Jensen. Let's talk about it. The content on this channel is for informational purposes only and shouldn't be taken as legal advice. Always consult a qualified attorney or HR professional for guidance on your specific situation. And hey, don't forget to like and subscribe. This case begins with Lois Jenson, who began working at Eveleth Mines on March 24th, 1975, at the age of 27 years old. Lois was a single mother, and prior to taking the job at Eveleth, she worked at a bank earning minimum wage. The bank paid so little that Lois had to go on welfare to help supplement the food and other things she needed for her family. So her motivation for getting a job at the mines was to support her family. She was earning $1.50 an hour at the bank, and at the mines, she was paid a little over $5 an hour. In the 1970s, the federal government was stepping up its efforts to make workplaces more equal. There was a lot of political pressure in terms of a lack of equality in hiring decisions. And so companies in male dominated industries like mining were required to hire more women and more minorities to comply with affirmative action policies and also anti discrimination laws. Eveleth Taconite, like many other companies, had to open its workforce to women due to these federal regulations. And even though the mining industry had historically excluded them, it was now going to be required to include women in its hiring process. And Lois Jensen was one of the first women hired after the company was forced to comply with equal employment laws. Not long after Lois started working at Evelyn, she got a loud and unwelcome message right in front of everyone. A male coworker shouted at her and said, "What are you doing here? You don't belong here. Go back home." And unfortunately, that was just the beginning. She was later groped in the crotch while other men stood by. They were laughing and cheering this guy on as he did it. She faced constant verbal abuse, threats of sexual assault, and intimidation. At one point, there was an engineer who had been persistently pursuing a romantic relationship with her, and he called her into his office because she had rejected and returned some of his gifts that he'd sent to her. And when he called her into his office, he physically assaulted her while others nearby, some pretty senior leaders in the company, overheard her yells for help and asking him to stop, and they did absolutely nothing. Men and men alone were employed as hourly employees for the first 10 years that Eveleth Mines was in business. Women didn't begin to work there until 1975, and at that time, men occupied every single supervisory and managerial position, and women occupied mostly the lower level jobs like administrative workers and secretaries. As a result, relationships of authority and power, they often, if not always, disfavored women. Lois was hired to work in a very male dominated environment. And not only that, there was a strong cultural resistance to women working in the mines. But as I read through this case, I saw evidence of the workers acting as the mouthpiece for how the leaders at the company really felt about many things, especially about being forced by the federal government to hire women. And as we go through this case, you're going to understand why I am saying that. But for now, let me share that it was clear that the leaders did not instruct the workers to stop the conduct that was inappropriate. That it would have been inappropriate for these men to do this to another man, let alone to any woman, especially considering Lois's stature. She was 27 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, so a very petite frame. But again, I do believe that they were the mouthpiece for how the senior leaders in the company really felt. Eveleth Mines wasn't just male dominated in terms of leadership and jobs and power, it was also male dominated in terms of inappropriate behavior. At Eveleth Mines, men controlled almost every aspect of the workplace, and that included how women were treated. They constantly made sexual comments, treating women as objects rather than coworkers. And this wasn't just an occasional bad behavior or an oopsie every once in a while. It was an everyday reality. There were sexualized images and messages everywhere, graffiti, photos. The graffiti actually had some of the women's names posted above it so that it was an image of a woman being portrayed as a woman who worked there. There were crude, inappropriate cartoons that covered the walls. They were on equipment. They were in locker rooms. They were in break rooms, in restrooms. They were everywhere women worked, and management let it stay up. Male employees felt very free to display or share sexually explicit materials wherever and whenever they wanted. So, this reinforced the idea that women didn't belong there. But it wasn't just the visuals. I mean, they were bad enough. The language in the workplace was just as toxic. Both men and women did curse at work, but only the men took it further. They routinely made comments about women's bodies, their sex lives, and even directly asked women for sexual favors and what their sex life was like with their significant other. They asked the women to engage in sex acts with them. They also used pet names like honey or babe, and while these terms are harmless, maybe in some environments, it was just another example of a larger pattern of disrespect towards women in a work environment where women were already being degraded. The fact that sexually explicit materials were openly posted in common areas was enough to prove a hostile work environment. But when you add in the bad language, the inappropriate words, and the constant harassment, it's clear that Eveleth Mines was a workplace built to push women out. Hey, are you still watching? If you find this video helpful, please take a moment to like and subscribe. Your support really helps. Thanks. Women at Eveleth Mines were also subjected to sexual related physical acts that ranged from a man pretending to perform oral sex on a woman worker while she was sleeping, to a man touching a woman's genitals, to a woman being presented with various dildos, one of which was named Big Red. A woman who was using a portable restroom had the entire restroom lifted under her while she was in there, all the while calling women names like bitch, whore, and cunt. And all the while this was happening, Lois Jenson made formal complaints with human resources, union leaders, and other company officials, but there was no change. Absolutely nothing was done. Day after day, it did not matter how many complaints she raised, they did nothing. The company was frustrated with Lois. They were frustrated because they saw her as stepping out of line. She was trying to tell them what to do, how to manage their business, and they made it clear that they didn't want to be told what to do. First, the EEOC told them they had to start hiring people who weren't white men. They wanted them to invite women, white women, and other minorities to work at a company that didn't have that as a requirement. And now Jensen was pushing them to actually hold employees accountable for harassment. Eveleth Taconite wasn't about to take direction from anyone, not the government, not the courts, and certainly not from a 20 something year old like Lois Jenson. And to make matters worse, they actually blamed Lois for experiences that she complained about. After many years, 9 years of enduring this, it began to affect her health. She decided to take legal action by filing a complaint with the EEOC in 1984. And the retaliation on the job, it really amped up after that. Despite her best efforts, she went to union meetings. She made everyone aware of what she was fighting for: fairness, equal rights, and most of all, to stop the harassment that women were experiencing in the workplace every day. But the harassment continued, and eventually, all of this took its toll, and Lois had to take a leave of absence. Her last day working at the company was January 21st, 1992. It had gotten to her so much that she couldn't go back to work. Her self esteem was low, her mental health was low, and enduring daily harassment at work had taken its toll. So her doctors wouldn't release her to return to work because she was in no state, in no condition to do so. Evelyn tried to defend itself. It's amazing that after all the women were experiencing and the harassment and the inappropriate conduct, that they didn't go to the courtroom with the settlement in mind. I think that really captures the type of company we're talking about, the type of leaders we're talking about. They tried to defend this behavior. And they tried to defend it by arguing that the women also cursed and they also used inappropriate language on the job. So they couldn't have actually found the men's behavior unwelcome or inappropriate. They even claimed that both men and women used the same kind of language and told similar jokes. So there was no real harassment. But that wasn't their only argument. Let's get into some of the aggressive and frankly disturbing legal tactics that Eveleth Taxonite used to fight the lawsuit. And just to be clear, these weren't legitimate defenses. They were blatant intimidation tactics that were designed to discredit the women, to drag out the case. The first legal tactic was to force Lois and other plaintiffs, other women who also came forward, to undergo very intrusive, invasive psychological examinations. And when I say intrusive, I mean extremely. These were questions that were asked by psychologists that were paid for by Eveleth, and they asked the women questions about their childhood traumas, their past relationships, their past personal lives, things that were really unrelated to the harassment that they experienced or that they claimed they experienced in the courtroom. And what they were doing with this tactic was trying to discredit the women. They were trying to show that they were emotionally unstable and therefore unreliable as witnesses about what they experienced. Bringing in psychologists for this case was completely unheard of at the time. So it just goes to show how far they were willing to go to break these women down and try to make them give up. But the second tactic was dragging out the legal process. The lawsuit itself lasted for over a decade because the company had appealed every single ruling, and they had just repeated efforts to stall and delay the proceedings. They would schedule a court hearing and then they would postpone it, and just everything that they could do to try to manipulate the court proceedings and make the women suffer even longer. You can imagine 10 years in and of itself, if you were still going to work every day while this lawsuit was ongoing, that environment had not changed, and you are also having to endure this 10-year court courtroom debacle. I mean, I don't know what you want to call it, but it certainly isn't the way you would expect courtroom proceedings to go. The fact that it lasted for 10 years is very indicative of the type of company that Eveleth was. They appealed, like I said, nearly every ruling, and many of the women, Lois Jenson and others who came forward after her, suffered severe emotional and financial distress. It was overwhelming. And as the case dragged on, these women endured more and more hardships. And of course, as I was reading through the case and doing research on Lois Jenson, I couldn't help but wonder, what was the harm of hiring women? What was the harm of expanding the workforce so that it included more than white men? And it just goes to show you that some people are raised to believe certain things, and there is no changing that. Whoever was managing that corporation was raised to believe that it was only men. It was men's work, and men needed to earn the money, and women need to stay in their place. And there were no minorities, there were no white women, there were only white men that could be employed at this company. And you have to wonder, at what point do you rise above that? And I think that some people will never rise above that. And that means that this type of personality, this type of pervasive thinking will always be around. It will always be with us. And so it's important to remember that as you encounter these people and engage with these types of organizations, that you refrain from doing so to the degree that you can, and to the degree that you can, you fight against it as well. So, the third and final tactic that they used was that they denied and downplayed the harassment that the women experienced. They flat out refused to acknowledge that the work environment was hostile. They didn't care if the evidence they had, all of the documentation, the witnesses, their legal team, the team that was representing Evelyn, said that the women were exaggerating in their stories, they were exaggerating about the behavior, and that it was just a part of working in a male dominated industry. And if they wanted to work in a male dominated industry, this was the way it is, and they just needed to accept that. Attempted to frame the women, to get the judge to think of the women as troublemakers rather than actual victims of harassment. And I heard Lois Jenson actually say that she hated being called a victim. She saw herself as a victor, not a victim. But in harassment allegation cases, this is the way that she was portrayed. And it's just the oddity of the fact that she didn't want to be labeled that way. The courtroom and the proceedings actually gave her that label. Another tactic they used was to try and intimidate and silence Lois and others that eventually came forward. Some women faced retaliation at work, and it made it even harder for them to continue working every day under those conditions. And it also made it harder for the women who were continuing to work to also, again, have to go to the courtroom and have to submit to these psychological exams. So they were just hitting them from all sides. And, again, I just, the amount of courage that it took to face this, I can't imagine. I imagine that many did give up and would have given up if it weren't for Lois and the camaraderie that they had as a group. The court ultimately rejected Eveleth's argument. They said that, yes, the women and the mines cursed, some of them freely. There was no evidence that they used language and slurs that were intensely degrading to or towards women. And the court also said that women didn't discuss their sex lives at work in front of men, and they didn't routinely engage in questioning men about their sex lives or interest in sexual activities. They also said that a woman's use of foul language at Eveleth or sexual innuendo in a consensual setting does not waive their legal protections against unwanted harassment. And the court went further and said that if a woman said the word fuck at work, that doesn't imply that they're inviting any and every form of sexual harassment. Judge in this case, let me just say, he was very compassionate for what these women endured. He said something about its attempt to break the human spirit. And I thought that was very telling. Of course, I didn't listen or go through every single piece of document in the case. I basically looked at the court records to see exactly what happened in the case. But even still, from what I read, I can't imagine listening to the entire case. For a judge to be so moved to write something like that, it goes beyond what's happening in the legal proceeding. It's talking about the company's attempt to literally uh, destroy these women and destroy every aspect of them. And so, before we talk about the end of the case, I do want to bring your attention to the length of the case, where it all started, and how it all ended in 1998. So, in 1984, Jensen filed her initial complaint with the EEOC. It wasn't until 1988 that she filed a lawsuit under Title VII claiming a hostile environment. So you can imagine from 84 to 88, her employer knew that she had filed this complaint. So I'm almost certain that, she was experiencing some pretty incredible harassment between 84 and 88, even though she had already been enduring harassment. It just ramped up after she filed that complaint. And then in 91, the case was actually it actually became a class action lawsuit, because that's when the other women at the workplace also joined Lois in this fight, and helped supporting her and themselves as well about this environment and how it needed to change, and also making the court aware that this was a legitimate claim. It wasn't just one woman speaking up about an unfair workplace. It was hostile and it was aggressive. So that happened in 91. And then from 93 to 98, that's when the most intense parts of this legal battle happened. You had the company's aggressive legal tactics, which we've already talked about, and then the first ever court ordered psychological evaluation of harassment victims also took place. So it's easy to say that Lois Jenson is a hero. So you would think that having a judge and a courtroom decide that, yes, the women faced harassment and they endured hardships, and this is not looking good for you, Eveleth. You would think that they would try and provide a meaningful settlement to these women who have endured so much. But no, Eveleth fought against a meaningful settlement even after the court ruled in favor of the women. They pushed for lower settlements. They tried to avoid paying substantial damages. They did everything they could to try to derail the payout. They just wouldn't stop. And if you've ever encountered anybody like this, either in a workplace or in a personal relationship or any way of life, you know what this is like. You're dealing with someone that you just want to walk away because this is just never going to end. And for the women, that's exactly what they did. They finally decided that it wasn't worth another 10-year fight. And in 1998, after more than a decade of legal battles, the case settled for a menial $3.5 million. And if you look at any of the other cases that I have on my channel, you will see settlements for 60 million, 75 million, incredible settlements whenever companies subject employees to harassment of this nature. And this is probably the worst that I've seen in all of the cases that I've done. And I've done some pretty bad ones for this channel. So definitely check them out. But ultimately, the process had taken such an immense toll on the plaintiffs, particularly Lois Jenson. She suffered from severe PTSD. She already had to leave her job. She didn't walk out of this case with very much at all. Lois Jenson has been quoted as saying, "I didn't want to file charges. I didn't want to report these things or even talk about them. I wanted a job where I didn't have to go to work every day, wondering what was going to happen next. I didn't want special treatment. I wanted to stop the harassment." And let me just say, when issues like this happen, there are almost always other unethical practices happening behind the scenes. But in the end, Lois won. She didn't win her case, she made history. Thanks for watching today. If you found this story insightful, be sure to check out my harassment prevention videos for a better understanding about the workplace harassment laws that every employee should know. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. I'll see you in the next video.